Chapter 2. Fort Laurel Base Hospital, east of Los Angeles, early July. Sarah Connor opened sleep-gummed eyes and cast a fuzzy glance around the room. Hospital, she thought hazily. She should have been able to guess that without opening her eyes. The stiff, crackling mattress and that unmistakable institutional smell would have told her where she was. But she hadn't thought of that before opening her eyes. That wasn't like her. Did I wake up before? She wondered. She must have, otherwise she wouldn't have felt secure enough to simply open her eyes. Sarah opened her mouth and let a dry tongue grate across her lips. Her head ached. So did her body, she realized after a moment. Some painkiller must be wearing off. She turned her head and blinked to see Jordan Dyson wearing a hospital robe and a gown, reading a magazine in the chair beside her bed. Unconsciously, she made a slight sound of surprise, and Jordan looked up. He smiled and stood, picking up a cane as he limped over to stand next to the bed. A middling tall man in his 30s, very black, with bluntly handsome African features. Even with the pain and stiffness of his wounds, he moved well, with an aura of quiet competence. Something she'd learned how to spot in her years hanging out with mercenaries and smugglers and assorted hard men. Then the ex-FBI agent hung up the cane and placed his hands on the bed rail. "John's okay. He's home," he mouthed. "Are you thirsty?" he asked aloud. She answered with an which Jordan took as assent and offered her a cup with a straw in it. Sarah drank, her eyes never leaving his. John was all right, and back in Paraguay. She desperately wanted to ask about Dieter, but knew that she would have to wait for details until whoever Jordan thought was recording them lost interest in her. She was so tired. It was hard to focus, and she knew that soon she would lose her battle to stay awake. "What happened?" she asked, a little surprised to hear her voice slur. "I don't really remember," Jordan said. "I woke up beside you with a hole in my leg and Cyberdyne reduced to a burning hole in the ground." "You don't remember anything?" he asked, giving a slight shake of his head. "No," she said. He smiled slightly, and she was pleased to have given the right answer. "Would you like more?" he asked, offering the cup again. Sarah said, again, and he held the straw to her questing lips. As she drank, he lowered his eyelids, like someone drifting off, and he mouthed the word sleep to her. Her lips quirked up at the corners, and she obediently closed her eyes. She was safe for the time being. She had an ally who would watch her back. Montana, early July. The Terminator shut down the equipment that had been monitoring the Infiltrator unit as it matured in the cellar beneath the log house. The ambient light level was sufficient for it. A human would have seen only shapes in the dimness. A flicker of red LED displays breathed a sense of dank earth and sharp chemicals. The Infiltrator unit had reached the appropriate level of maturity without expiring, and had gone into a normal rest state. Its computer half had signaled complete integration with the unit's flesh side. Adult status. Now, the Terminator would take its orders from the Infiltrator. For now, it had some work to do debugging a computer game. Games were a bizarre concept to the machine. They obviously had no significant teaching function. They were simply a means of wasting time. The Infiltrator had told him that they had a pleasing effect on the brain. She should know, since she had one. There was a slight cognitive dissonance at the thought. The Infiltrator was primarily human flesh. It was female, therefore it was she. It was also a machine like the Terminator itself, and therefore an it. After a moment, the Terminator's processor concluded that the distinction was irrelevant. She, or it, the Infiltrator, was now in command. The Infiltrator would wake in a few hours. Then it, she, would require sustenance. In the meantime, the Terminator had work to do. The I-950 looked at her newly adult face in the mirror and decided to cut her hair. It would make her look more mature. She would dye it brown too, several shades darker than its natural bright blonde. It would be necessary to differentiate herself from her predecessor, Serena Burns, if she was going to infiltrate Cyberdyne. The last bout of accelerated maturation had been much less painful than the previous 6. But then, this had been more a matter of fine-tuning than brute growth. Based on the experiences of Serena, her parent, by next year all of the baby softness remaining in her features would be gone, leaving her face sculpted and ageless. She already had her identity in place. Social security number, driver's license, credit history. She was Clea Bennett. Who that would be would depend on the circumstances. She was looking forward to starting her assignment. Serena Burns had failed to protect Skynet, but at least she'd provided another Infiltrator unit to take up the task. 2, actually, Clea thought. She glanced at her little sister clone. Alyssa appeared to be 6. She was actually 6 months, 2 weeks old. Her growth, while more accelerated than Serena's, would be at a more sedate pace than Clea's. Unless, of course, Clea failed, and Alyssa's abilities were needed. But the growth process was dangerous, and if it could go forward at a slower pace, it would surely be better for the mission. Now that she was mature herself, Clea would soon implant a surrogate with her own replacement. Skynet must be protected. But there was a great deal to be done before they complicated their operation with a human incubator. Skynet was everything that was good and right in the world. It was regrettable that Clea's only experience with Skynet was through the memories of Serena Burns and not directly. Though, in a sense, she was Serena Burns. She was a clone of that Infiltrator. But experience had shown her that things were true in theory, but were not necessarily so in practice. The most perfect simulation of an experience was still merely a simulation. The I-950 was aware that she harbored an emotion, which she'd decided must be resentment toward her parent. It was unforgivable that Serena had failed Skynet at the hands of a mere human. After all, she had felt the touch of Skynet on her mind from birth, whereas Clea had developed in a state of abandonment. And yet, that isolation made her revere Skynet all the more, made her more fiercely dedicated to protecting and nurturing Skynet, as it was unable to do for her just now. Clea also instinctively knew that growing up in isolation with only the T-101s for company was going to make her awkward when she came in contact with humans. She had studied the files of Serena Burns' lessons and interactions with humans, and knew that her own experience would be different. There was much more to the species than Burns had thought. There had to be, or she wouldn't have been destroyed by them. Her files were full of incidents that showed the infiltrator uncertain about how her attempts to manipulate them would turn out. Usually, she had managed humans very well, but there had been surprises as well. Tricker, for example. Perhaps it was because Clea faced them without Skynet's backing, without legions of T-90s and T-101s behind her, that she was more wary of them than Burns had been. She had a much greater respect for their abilities than her predecessor. Many of them were extremely intelligent, for example. So much so that she'd begun to explore the possibility of using them to develop materials and computer components with the ultimate goal of making a T-1000. Although she would never entrust that research to a human, she could pick their brains regarding portions of the research. Clea had hacked into the highly secured files of a number of scientists with the intention of guiding their work. Sometimes her small improvements had languished for weeks as the scientist worked his or her way towards an erroneous conclusion, to be discovered only when they reviewed their entire project looking for mistakes. Others noticed the adjustments immediately and changed the direction of their work accordingly. One had tried to find her. Clea had never contacted that one again. That was more human intelligence than she was equipped to handle at the present time. She took a last look at her face in the mirror. Now that she was adult, it was time to begin interacting with humans directly. She had applied and been accepted for a job at a burger joint in the nearest town. Her reading and monitoring of television implied that most people acquired this sort of employment as their first job. It certainly promised to bring her into contact with a great many humans, if only in passing. Her feelings about the job bordered on negative. One emotion was definitely nervousness, which was probably appropriate for someone of her apparent age. The other emotion, Clea was less certain of. She suspected it might be fear. She knew that fear in an infiltrator was something that the Skynet of the future would not tolerate. It was a weakness, and the weak must be culled. She understood that. She also understood that for now, she was the only infiltrator available. She must overcome her weakness and get on with things. Skynet must be protected. New Luddite Headquarters, New York, New York. Ron LeBain flipped through the printouts of news reports about the New Luddites' various activities. The movement tended to get good press. But then, with every passing day, it became more mainstream. Not surprising after all. He'd designed the New Luddites to have a lot of middle-of-the-road appeal. His best-selling book had delineated the basic theories, how and why it was necessary to stop progress that created problems requiring solutions that only created more problems. He'd told the public how and why humanity should return to a simpler, if less convenient, lifestyle. Subsequent books had promoted clean, efficient public transport, with instructions on how to set up a community activist network. He'd created the New Luddite Foundation to promote research into clean fuel and new, less wasteful manufacturing methods. The money flowed in, and with it came increasing power. He glanced out the window and smiled. His office was deliberately modest, but it looked out on Central Park. Influential backers had flocked to his early seminars, and their backing gave him the clout needed to appeal to the majority. Once he had a sufficient number of dedicated Luddites in the fold, he could begin introducing the mainstream to more proactive solutions to the problem of environmental abuse. He smiled. Not as active as the select underground activists he aided and guided, from a careful distance, of course. But there would soon be a great deal more muscle available to make up for the less extreme tactics. He would also, of course, continue to enjoy his secret projects, like what had happened to Cyberdyne, for example. The general public knew nothing about the explosion that had purged the weapon designer from existence. But he knew, because his people were everywhere. When he'd heard the news, he'd shouted, "Yes!" at the top of his lungs. Now, perhaps, there would be no more work on that fully automated weapons factory that he'd already helped to destroy once. He hadn't heard anything more from the contact who had warned him about that. Perhaps the government had found out about him and had put a stop to his activities. A shame. He burned to know who had destroyed Cyberdyne's hidden base. The movement could use talent like that, since every day brought them a little closer to the seats of power, as well as destruction of the environment. Soon, he thought, and hoped it would be soon enough. Ron was disgusted with the more established environmentalist organizations. Long association with government had turned them into lobbyists instead of idealists. Mere horse traders, and dishonest ones at that. Once he would have checked himself, reminded himself that in spite of their flaws, they still got a lot of good work done. Now he felt an overwhelming sense of time running out, of events careening out of control, that he couldn't forgive the sellouts. More and more, even the smallest compromises seemed like selling out. Perhaps he was lacking a sense of proportion, or perhaps they were, when they were allowing themselves to be talked out of forest land and wetlands and more stringent regulations. How could he sympathize with those who were willfully blind to the changes in weather patterns, the increase in skin cancers, the mutated frogs? These were real warning signs, not the daydreams of a few paranoid fools. Ron dropped the news articles to the desk in disgust. "Don't they realize that this is a war?" His head came up. Wait, it needed to be more than a war. It had to become a crusade. Yes. He'd often thought that a profound change in the way things were done required an element of fanaticism, like a religious conversion. Like, dare he think it, Hitler's conversion of the German people to Nazism. If it worked for the bad guys, then why not for me? Education was key. He would fight for the hearts and minds of the coming generation. Uniforms are too extreme, he thought. But badges would work, and slogans. Banners, rallies, all the old tricks for capturing the imagination of a people. It could be done, even now when mere children were drenched in cynicism. Because human beings didn't really change from generation to generation. They only thought they did. He grabbed a pad and began writing up ideas. Craig Kipfer's office, Southern California. Craig Kipfer sat behind his brushed steel and glass desk, behind a good half-dozen security checkpoints, inside his bomb-proof and EMP-hardened bunker of an office. It was hard to believe that the elegant, artfully lit room was a reinforced concrete box. The air was fresh and warm, and rich draperies hid what might have been a window. The complete absence of exterior sounds made the room eerily, almost threateningly quiet. Or perhaps the sense of threat came from the man behind the desk. He had a rumpled, middle-aged face that was still, somehow, good-naturedly boyish. Until you looked into his agate green eyes. Then you couldn't imagine him ever being anything so innocent as a child. The fading red hair hinted at an impulsive temperament, a tendency he had fought his entire life, so successfully that he was known among his peers for his iron control. A control which, at this moment, was sorely tried. Cyberdyne had been bombed out of existence again. Kipfer finished the report he'd already read twice and tapped his intercom. "Send him in," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The door lock buzzed and Tricker entered, carefully closing the soundproof door behind him. Kipfer indicated the chair before his desk with one finger and waited while his agent took it. Then he waited some more, his eyes never leaving Tricker's face. Eventually, Tricker blinked and dropped his eyes. A hint of color bloomed over his collar, testimony of his humiliation. Kipfer observed these signs, and some part of him was mollified. The alpha wolf accepting submission from an inferior. Does anyone know the full story of what happened that night? Kipfer asked mildly. Because, from my viewpoint, there are a lot of unanswered questions. If anyone knows the full story, or as much of it as matters, it's Jordan Dyson, Tricker said. Unfortunately, he's covered. He has some very influential friends in the FBI who have made their interest obvious. And he has family who visit him daily. He's also very familiar with interrogation techniques and is therefore not easy to question. So, in spite of your own expertise in interrogation, Kipfer said, leaning back in his chair, you learned nothing, except that you suspect that he knows things he's not telling. Tricker stiffened under the implied criticism. He would have leaned on Dyson much harder but for the man's FBI contacts in inconvenient places, as he had just made clear. There was always bad blood between agencies fighting over the same resources, and the blacker the agency, the greater the resentment from the above-ground boys. It was always wise to be diplomatic in circumstances like these. Kipfer knew this. If he hadn't known all about interagency infighting, he wouldn't be seated on the other side of that desk. So, his boss was being unfair. But that was life. Exactly, sir, Tricker said, after a minute pause. Craig put his elbows on the arms of his chair and folded his hands under his chin. He allowed his gaze to drop from his agent's eyes, having made his point. Tricker was one of the best agents he had. No, probably the best. And he was right. There were limits to what one could and should do to a hostile witness, especially one from a competing agency. Professional courtesy and all. So, if he couldn't crack Dyson, it would take more than Kipfer was willing to sanction. Besides, the how of the thing wasn't really important. After all, Sarah Connor was in custody once again, and her son was only 16. Not that teenage boys weren't potentially dangerous. There was a reason armies liked them. He just thought that they were more limited in the type of harm they could do than adults. He doubted the kid was still in the US, but they had Sarah Connor, and eventually that would bring the kid into the light. One of the things that makes me suspicious of Dyson, Tricker said cautiously, is that he appears to have done a complete 180 on Sarah Connor. He's been at her bedside or visiting her constantly since she was admitted to the hospital. The doctors and nurses I've interviewed say that his concern seems genuine. Connor herself, predictably, isn't talking. That's something of a departure for her, isn't it? Kipfer asked. She's always been on the talkative side before, going on for hours about killer robots and Judgment Day and so on. Going by the records we received from Pescadero, she'd be off at the slightest provocation. Tricker shook his head. But not this time. She just gives you this accusing look like a kid getting teased by her classmates. Kipfer lifted a few pages of Tricker's report and read for a moment. Then he dropped them. You've taken the usual steps, I see. Keep me informed. Now. He met Tricker's eyes once more. Tell me about the project. Things are going very well, all things considered, the agent replied. Which was true. The scientists and engineers at their disposal weren't quite the top-flight talent that Cyberdyne had recruited, but they were plugging along. At least as far as he could tell, and he, unfortunately, was in the position of having to take their word for it. Things would go better still, Tricker added, if we could manage to recruit Weimeister. And I think he could be tempted. His work is important to him, and he was, according to the last reports we received from Cyberdyne, making great strides. But he's still under contract to them, and since we don't want to admit that we have a clone project up and running, it's going to take some delicate handling. Kipfer made a rude sound and sat forward, pulling his chair into his desk. Dr. Weimeister isn't someone you handle delicately, he said. We've got enough on him to change his career from scientist to license plate maker. Just hit him over the head with an axe handle and ship him to the base. When he wakes up, tell him that. Then show him a fully equipped lab where he can pick up his project where he left off. I think you'll find he will cooperate. Especially when he won't have any other option. This guy's not even a citizen. Tricker frowned thoughtfully. I thought he was naturalized. There's no record of it, Craig said easily. It wasn't necessary to add, not anymore. Tricker allowed himself a slight smile. Sometimes it was fun working for the government, at least when you were working for this part of it. And since he didn't really like Weimeister, seeing the arrogant Kraut taken down was going to be pure pleasure. One of life's little bonuses. In any case, he's liable to be... Kipfer wiggled one hand. Upset about his new location. I think we can guarantee that he'll be upset, sir. Tricker dared to say. So, I'm going to assign you to the base, just to make sure things run smoothly for, say, the next few months. Tricker's jaw dropped. It only showed in his slightly parted lips, but an equivalent expression in an ordinary citizen would have included drool. Sir, I have no scientific qualifications for observing this project, he said carefully. You'll be handling security, Kipfer said, his eyes like green nails. My secretary has a package with all the necessary tickets and permits. You can pick it up on your way out. On my way out, Tricker said. He felt as though his blood had frozen in his veins. Yes, you have 2 days to wind up any outstanding business you may have. His boss was giving him nothing, no opening to protest, no idea how long this ultra-dead-end assignment in America's secret Siberia was to last. This was his punishment. He'd known in his heart that it was coming. You didn't screw up an assignment this badly, losing the one artifact remaining to them, and not answer for it. After all, no one even knew what had become of Tricker's predecessor. He took a deep breath. "That'll be more than sufficient," he said. If the powers that be were adamant that he be punished, he might as well take it with a little dignity. "Is there anything else you need to tell me?" Kipfer asked. "No, sir. I think we've covered everything." Craig turned his attention to another file from his in-basket. "Then I guess I can let you go," he said, looking up. "Bon voyage." Tricker lifted one corner of his mouth in a pseudo-smile. "Thank you, sir," he said, rising. "I'll send you a postcard." Kipfer looked up, his eyes dead. "Just send your reports." Tricker suppressed a sigh. "Yes, sir." After the door closed, Kipfer put down the report he wasn't really reading. He leaned back with a thoughtful frown. It was a waste of talent to send Tricker off to the hinterlands to cool his heels. Unfortunately, the Cyberdyne fiasco required some sort of response. Craig sat up and opened the discarded file. He'd reclaim his agent in about 6 months. That ought to be long enough for Tricker to begin to despair of ever being rescued. Maybe it should be 8 months. It depended on what came along. He supposed it was only just that he be deprived of something he valued too. This disaster had occurred on his watch after all. Enough introspection. Kipfer turned his attention back to the new file. Fort Laurel Base Hospital, California. Jordan Dyson shifted his wounded leg into a slightly more comfortable position, which wasn't much of an improvement. "You sure can tell when the meds are wearing off," he thought. Sarah Connor had shot him, of all the ironic things. She'd also shot his older brother, Miles. The only difference being that she'd shot Miles before he was convinced about Terminators, and himself after he'd discovered their reality. In a strange way, despite his wound, his lost job, and the horrors he'd witnessed, Dyson felt a sense of peace. He now knew that his brother had died trying to destroy his own work, to ensure that Skynet and the Terminators never happened. And he was proud of him. He could lay Miles to rest in his own heart and mind, and move on. His long-held hatred for Sarah Connor had begun to fade upon his first encounter with a Terminator. Now, in his brother's memory, he felt a growing friendship for her, and a tremendous respect. Jordan looked up as the door opened and Tricker came in. "This will be your final debriefing," Tricker said. The agent put his hands in his pockets and looked down at the former FBI agent. "Connor seems to like you," he observed. "Connor is still woozy," Dyson replied. "We'll have to wait to see how she really feels." He put down the book he'd been reading. "What do you want to know?" Tricker looked at Jordan for a long time before he answered. Part of that time he was thinking about his new assignment. But he returned his mind to the business at hand with the discipline born of years in the field. Dyson was looking back at him with a bland expression that he could probably hold for a very long time. What would he like to know? He'd like to know why Dyson was in Connor's room every day, giving her encouragement and sips of water after spending the last almost 7 years hunting her down in the belief that the Connors had killed his brother in the original attack on Cyberdyne. And what had happened to her son, and how much had the kid helped her blow up Cyberdyne a second time? And how the hell had Connor gotten that wound? The gunshots were standard enough, but the one in her middle looked, the doctor had said, like someone had done it with their hand. But he didn't think he was going to find out what he wanted to know. Dyson was clearly a reluctant witness, and Tricker had other things to do. Ah well, you have to have a high frustration tolerance in this line of work. After a moment, he leaned forward, resting one hand on the back of Jordan's chair. "I'd like to know why you're suddenly on her side," he said confidently. He searched Dyson's eyes for a moment, then tightened his lips and straightened. "But I doubt I ever will." Tricker gave him an assessing look. "Watch your back, Dyson," he said, and left the room. Jordan looked at the door for a moment, then leaned his head against the chair back. "You too," he thought. Santa Monica, California. Kurt Weimeister stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his luxurious home without seeing the mountain and surf and crimson cloud sunset they framed. He tightened a massive fist. What gave that government stooge the right? Kurt stopped himself with an effort. Might gave Tricker the right. The government had kept backup copies of the data on his project. Copies which he himself, the creator, had been forbidden to keep. Now they would only release them to him if he agreed to work on it in the place they chose under still more of their insane restrictions. It was maddening. He turned on his heel and went to his weights room. He stripped to his shorts, put on a belt, and began to use the Nautilus. His project. His. Kurt reset the weight chock at 250 and lifted again. With a hiss of breath, he lifted, then slowly let the weight down again. He felt himself grow calmer as the effort purged the fight-flight toxins from his blood. The government needed him to complete the project, and they had to know it. Being a necessary part of things gave him some leverage. Unfortunately, given the current location of the project, once he committed himself, they had the upper hand again. Even more so than before. So. He sat up and wiped his face with a towel. Who was he kidding? Once he was at their secret base, they could ignore any of his demands with impunity, and he knew that. Kurt lay back on the bench with a deep sigh. He needed to complete his work. It was like an addiction, and knowing he couldn't do so until they let him was agony. No. This time, the ignorant weaklings had him right where they wanted him, and he had no choice but to give them what they wanted. Very well, he would concede, though he would, of course, make them pay dearly for his defeat. And who knew? One day he might get to pound Tricker's face right off its bones. With that happy thought firmly in his mind, he went back to his regimen, feeling better, if not satisfied.